One of the more interesting questions in esoteric circles is just what one means by hermetic. It's a fascinatingly elastic concept that has come to include a range of literature, including ancient philosophical soteriological texts like the famed Corpus Hermeticum and Asclepius, of course, along with a range of teachings ascribed to Hermes Trismegistus and other literature. This, in addition to a confusing mass of magical, astrological, and alchemical literature, and even 20th century channeled texts basically representing new thought such as the Kybalion. In some sense or another, all of these texts are regarded as somehow hermetic in nature. Now, I'm not going to wade into the debate over which texts really are hermetic or not, especially the Kybalion. I will say that Dr. Dana Trell has a fine video analyzing the question about whether the Kybalion is hermetic, and Sam Bloch has made some really powerful arguments against any historical connection or intellectual connection or spiritual connection between the ancient hermetic texts and the Kybalion as a book. You can find links to those texts and their work in the description. Rather, I want to ask a kind of meta question. What about the Hermetica, or Hermeticism, makes for such a big tent, and by extension for such a debate at all? And to think aloud, really to think aloud about that meta-Hermetica question, I want to turn to the printing history of the Corpus Hermeticum itself at the very dawn of all of this, at least in modernity, to shed some light on how this term maybe became so elastic in intellectual and spiritual history. Of course, my thoughts in this episode aren't going to be by any means exhaustive, and they certainly won't answer this question. I think it's very complex. But hopefully they will enrich our conversation of what became Hermetic by looking at how these texts got printed and how they travel through time. Of course, if you're interested in magic or Hermetic philosophy, alchemy, and Kabbalah, you should make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica and check out my other content on topics in esotericism. Also, if you want to support this work of providing accessible, scholarly, and free content on topics in esotericism here on YouTube for free, I'd hope you consider supporting my work on Patreon with a one-time donation. You can pick up some cool merch over at our merch store, and you can use the super thanks option in the video as well. But now, some meta-hermetic musing inspired by the history of the printing of the Corpus Hermeticum. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. These comments are going to go some of the way to forming the foundations of what I'll be speaking about in the roundtable at the Embassy of the Free Mind with Professor Walter Hanegraaff. Now, I'm writing this before that roundtable, and you're perhaps watching it after that roundtable, so who knows exactly what will happen between then and there, but those are just the vicissitudes of how thoughts go. But what's motivating these thoughts is the theme of the roundtable. Hermes yesterday and today, thinking about how this character or this idea of Hermeticism has traveled through time. Specifically, as I mentioned in the introduction, this sort of great elasticity of what has become to be grouped as Hermetic or the Hermetica. Now, it's basically a tautology to say that anything associated through ascription to Hermes Trismegistus is Hermetic. And that's true, of course, but it's trivially true, as a good tautology ought to be. And rather than trying to see what a whole basket of texts through history have in common, and then naming that as a kind of Hermetic core for which any proper ascription of Hermetic must obtain, I want to think specifically and very narrowly about the early printing of the history of the Corpus Hermeticum, and see what, if anything, frankly, that such an investigation might prove in terms of what's helpful for illuminating this problem, I suppose. If nothing else, I think everyone agrees on the centrality of the Corpus Hermeticum for any sense of what Hermetica might be, and its early printing history is, well, it's just interesting on its own. As students of the Hermetica know, in 1462, Marsilio Ficino interrupted. He really just postponed starting his translation of the Platonic corpus to translate the recently recovered Corpus Hermeticum. Now, contrary to legend, it was probably just because of the relative brevity of the Corpus Hermeticum that Ficino postponed his Plato translation, not totally, and certainly not necessarily because of the perceived importance of the Corpus Hermeticum itself. In fact, it doesn't seem to have had a huge impact on Ficino's own philosophical and religious belief. He was more on the Neoplatonism train in many ways. Further, it appears that Ficino either botched the translation, which I do think is unlikely, though it was his first real translation project, or I think what's more likely that it was just a very rough draft, and that rough draft translation was basically taken to press without Ficino's permission. Again, probably because the translation was unfinished or Ficino knew that it needed more work, though there's evidence in the translation, Ficino's translation of the Corpus Hermeticum, that he actually attempted to improve upon the admittedly shabby style of the original Greek, and even to try to bring some of the ideas into line with his own more Neoplatonic leanings. So it's unclear what's going on with this half-butchered translation of the Corpus Hermeticum. Regardless, this likely incomplete translation came to print in the famous Treviso edition on 18th of December 1471, which was further marred by the inexperience and the incompetence on the part of the printers. To my knowledge, it was the first book that printing house had ever printed, and they were apparently rather rushed in setting the type. Thus, the famous 1471 Pymander, the foundation of Hermetic discourse into the modern period, it entered the intellectual stage in a rather poor showing. Translation was badly done, it was incomplete, it was published without Ficino's permission, and it was badly printed. In fact, later editors attempted to correct the problems in the 1471, which only led to widen the gap between the printed edition and the Corpus Hermeticum. And while other more reliable editions did appear, they didn't actually prove popular, even though they were actually better than the original 1471. And the 1471 version would go on to become basically the official translation and represented Hermetic philosophy in spirituality to European culture for hundreds of years. Now, consider that for a moment. If you're reading a competent translation of the Corpus Hermeticum like the Copenhagen, you have better access to historical Hermetic ideas than Pico and Bruno, Agrippa, John Dee, etc. The giants of modern Hermetic philosophy labored mostly with a defective texts, badly printed, and the intellectual content they produce is lauded as a kind of Hermetic renaissance by many scholars. Certainly us, with better access to the original Hermetic text, both in Greek and in Latin and English and other languages, are actually in a better position to produce Hermetic genius. So never let anyone use that tradition card against you. Sometimes, often, tradition is just pure pressure from dead people who often even lack the tools you have. At any rate, while the printing history of the Corpus Hermeticum Simplicator is rather crucially important and well worth a more full discussion, I want to turn to how the text was integrated into the wider Prisca Theologia discourse of the Renaissance, specifically by seeing how it was grouped and then printed with other texts, thus further setting the tenor for what will be regarded as Hermetic in the Renaissance and the early modern period, and eventually in our minds, in contemporary minds. Now, to do that, we need to turn to the press of Aldus Manutius. It was founded in 1494 in Venice, but it was actually bankrolled by the wealthy Pico family, including Pico della Mirandola, and it was intimately connected to Marsilio Ficino, even publishing some of his works, and as we'll see, some of his translations as well. But the Aldine Press was founded as a true engine of the Renaissance, with the express purpose of publishing accessible editions of Greek and Roman classics in their original forms, creating very clear, beautiful, custom Greek and Latin typefaces designed for easy legibility. Some of these small form editions, they even basically set the stage for what became the modern paperback. In a very short time, the Aldine Press rightfully gained a reputation for very, very high quality editions and has gone down in history as one of the best, most accurate, and beautiful printing houses in all of history. If you ever get the chance to leaf through an Aldine text, please treat yourself. They're marvelous. In fact, if you've ever marveled at that classic of Renaissance surrealism, the Hypnerotomachia Polyphili by Francesco Colonna, you've appreciated the work of the Aldine Press. It's maybe one of the most beautiful books ever printed. Just 2 years, though, after the first publication in 1495, Manutius would bring to press a collection of works translated from Greek into Latin by Ficino, including Ficino's own short treatise on true pleasure as he understands it from Plato. This 1497 collection, published just 2 years before Ficino's death, would include a fascinating assortment of Platonic and Neoplatonic texts with a distinctive magical bent, actually all anchored around the first edition of Iamblichus's on the Egyptian mysteries in Latin. In fact, it was meant to be kind of a precursor for Ficino's translation of Plato. Now, this volume would include On the Egyptian Mysteries by Iamblichus, a commentary on the Alcibiades by Plato, maybe it's by Plato, On the Soul and on the Daimones by Proclus, On Sacrifice and Magic, also by Proclus, On Deities and Daemons by Porphyry, On Dreams by Synesius, On Daimones, or really On Demons, by Michael Psellus, the great Byzantine Christian writer, a commentary on Theophrastus's text On the Senses by Priscian, an introduction to the philosophy of Plato by Alcinous, On Plato's Definitions by Speusippus, which was Plato's nephew and therefore the inheritor of the Ancient Academy, Maxims and Symbols by Pythagoras, or at least attributed to Pythagoras, On Death by Xenocrates, and finally the 12th book On Pleasure by Marsilio Ficino himself, the only non-ancient text in the collection. In effect, it's a mystical grab bag of the more arcane ritual and magical texts extracted from a range of classical writers. It's precisely the kind of volume that an aspiring Renaissance magus would want to pick up. Now, if you're interested in the contents of that volume, or the later volume, slightly later volume, you can check out my episode on a slightly later edition of the same text, where I discuss each one of these in a great more detail. But as you'll notice, it doesn't contain the Corpus Hermeticum. Not yet at least. However, when this same edition was reissued in 1516, it was greatly expanded, both by the inclusion of a larger selection of works by Ficino, especially works representing magic and other medical topics from the 3 books on life, but also at the very heart of this collection now can be found the Corpus Hermeticum and the Asclepius in the defective 1471 edition of Ficino's translation. Now, I suspect the tie that binds here is less about this all being sort of a Ficino fan show, but more how the Aldine Press thought to group the Corpus Hermeticum, and of course, these other volumes seem to make reasonable company. When you put them all together, it seems like a natural home for the Corpus Hermeticum. The ancient Egyptian sage Hermes Trismegistus is now at home with Iamblichus's Egyptian theurgy, some Pythagorean lore, the foundations of Platonic theology more generally, along with a healthy dose of Neoplatonic magic, all brought together into one conversation and practice with the contemporary Ficino. It all seems like it makes sense and coheres together as a collection. And yet, while all this seems cozy enough to us and to the Aldine printers, it's well worth noting just how varied these texts actually are intellectually. Iamblichus and Porphyry deeply disagreed with one another about the role of sacrifice in theurgy, with Proclus certainly being on Team Iamblichus. Psellus's On Demons inherits some pagan lore, but is thoroughgoingly Christian in its analysis of such beings, much to be contrasted with, for instance, the rituals of Proclus and his text on the hieratic art. The Corpus Hermeticum itself, of course, is a distinct form of Egyptian philosophy and soteriology, often very much at odds with Platonism's tendency towards dualism. Ficino, of course, represents a kind of Neo-Platonism, infused, of course, heavily with Christianity, with a highly sanitized theory of magic, very much again at odds, though influenced by Iamblichus and much less so the Corpus Hermeticum. Again, at first this collection seems like a perfect fit, but with a little bit more scrutiny and just reading it, it's actually a rather tense collection. But the harmony of this collection, or the apparent harmony of it with the Corpus Hermeticum at its heart, is all vouchsafed as a true classic by their Aldine publication, is probably the result of how Renaissance printers, intellectuals, and readers grouped them together under the aegis of recovering that Prisca Theologia, such that their mystical core of all of these writers was perennially safe. That their very real philosophical and religious disagreements, they were pretty deprioritized in that process. Thus, what I suspect is operating in this collection is a kind of a priori perennialism and commitment to the Prisca Philosophia and Theologia that is the guiding principle that caused these texts to be grouped together here and, to this day, considered largely to be sort of a flock of the same feather. We still group all these writers together and as if they all agreed at some level. Even the term Neoplatonism still covers over the profound disagreements between people that we group in that school. It's really not a school at all. Now, this 1516 edition would be the last of the collection like this published by the Aldine Press. However, it must have proven pretty popular, and in Basel in 1532, a pared down version of that same edition, it would also be the 11th edition of the Corpus Hermeticum, though it does use a different manuscript from the 1471 edition. The manuscript history of the Corpus Hermeticum is also just a mess. However, the Corpus Hermeticum was now front and center in this edition. It was again a collection flanked by On the Egyptian Mysteries by Iamblichus, a commentary on Plato's Alcibiades, on the soul and on the daimones by Proclus, on sacrifice and magic also by Proclus, and on deities and daimons by Porphyry. What's interesting, aside from the shift in prominence between the Corpus Hermeticum and Iamblichus, is what's missing from this 1532 edition versus the 1516 Aldine. Gone now are most of the Platonic and Pythagorean texts, along with all of the Ficino, though his translations do typically bend their text in his philosophical direction, so he's haunting the text, if nothing else. Also missing in this edition is the Physalis mini textbook on demons, though not for long, it'll make a reappearance. Now, this collection has certainly shifted the tenor of the volume away from being a Platonism primer, which was original there in 1497, with a touch of magic on the side, to a much more magical theurgical collection, with the primordial pagan wisdom of Hermes Trismegistus now really front and center. Again, this tilt in the direction of the magical is clearly signaling the potential reader, but also shifting what kind of associations readers will come to have of the Corpus Hermeticum and those other texts. And in 1549, this collection would take its final form now at Lyon. In this edition, the Pride of Place has been returned to Iamblichus. Iamblichus is now the anchor text, flanked by the same texts. Proclus, Porphyry, now Michael Sellis's On Demons is returned to the collection, and the whole text is now bookended by the Corpus Hermeticum and the Asclepius, though again this time in the defective 1471 translation, making it the 12th overall edition of the Corpus Hermeticum. With the reedition of Michael Sellis's On Demons, the text now leans even more into that magical tenor. A demonological work is of course a must-have for any up-and-coming magus. This collection would go into numerous editions through the 17th century, again indicating its popularity. But also, to drive this point home, insofar as the Corpus Hermeticum traveled in the specific collection with these specific texts, they must have all become increasingly grouped together in the minds of readers and intellectuals. When we talk about the 12th edition of the Corpus Hermeticum, we're talking about the 12th edition in a book with other books, and those books color how that text is perceived. Thus, especially when viewed in parallel developments in religious and philosophical esotericism, this must have been how a great many people, including some of the big people in the history of Western esotericism, first encountered the Corpus Hermeticum, and thus how their understanding of it must have been colored. And this now circles back to my original thought. Why does the term Hermetic have such a wide set of valances to produce an ongoing debate about just what is and isn't Hermetic? The point I want to make, and it's only a rather small point in the end, I suppose, is that the Corpus Hermeticum as a text has traveled for a substantial portion of its early life, and especially the period of its life where it was making the biggest impact in Western intellectual culture, in collections that have shaped how we conceive of the wisdom said to be contained in its pages. And just as a slight adjustment in the aim of an arrow can have a large effect upon where the arrow strikes, so too, I suggest, did these early collections of the Corpus Hermeticum how they colored how we now conceive of what is Hermetic. Again, this suggestion is by no means meant to be some exhaustive answer, but I think that the printing history of the Corpus Hermeticum is an important and certainly interesting part of that puzzle. In this way, because the context of the travel of the Corpus Hermeticum has been embedded with these other texts, a strict denotative sense of Hermetic has actually given way to a sense of Hermetic taking on what we might call a floating signifier, to use some language from semiotics. It's not totally arbitrary, of course. You can't say anything is Hermetic. But there's also an operative polysemic relation going on here with a range of meanings. I mean, primordial wisdom, exotic Egyptian salvation religion, mysterious hidden wisdom, the secrets of nature, alchemy, astrology, Gnostic monism, all of them somehow connected to what Hermeticism is, and yet none of them are, strictly speaking, Hermeticism. And of course, while these connotations were probably present even from antiquity, they certainly took on a very specific valence when they appeared in Europe in the company of the other texts that came along for the ride with the Corpus Hermeticum through its early printing history. Thus, I would suggest that the printing history of the Corpus Hermeticum is a small but important part of the puzzle, but it also explains why this term floats in the manner that it does. We all float down there. This is something of a sketch of a thought, and perhaps I'll open it up and expand upon it more in time. But this floatiness of the signifier Hermetic also means that the future of what Hermetic will be is also rather open. Hermetically open. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.